The envelope had been sitting under the bus seat for 11 minutes before Marcus saw it. He would always remember that detail. 11 minutes. He knew because the 38 downtown had been 6 minutes late pulling away from the Halstead stop, and he had been watching the clock on his phone the whole ride, calculating whether he could still make the 7:30 shift at the sub shop on North Clark before his manager docked him again. He reached down to grab his backpack strap, and his fingers found the edge of something that did not belong there. A brown leather purse, zipper slightly parted, the corner of an overstuffed envelope visible inside. Marcus was 16 years old. He had $12 in his checking account and a school lunch balance that had been negative since February. His mother, Renee, worked 2 jobs and still sometimes asked her sister to spot the gas bill. They lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on the west side of Chicago where the heat ran 4 months a year and the landlord answered calls about the other 8 approximately never. He did not open the purse on the bus. He held it on his lap and looked out the smeared window at the grey February street and felt the weight of it, and the weight was considerable. The bus was half empty. A woman 2 rows ahead had her eyes closed against the window. A man near the back was eating something from a paper bag. No one was watching him. He sat with the purse balanced on his knees and felt the soft heat of it through the leather, and he thought about his $12, and he thought about the negative lunch balance, and he thought about the timing belt his mother's car had needed in March, and what that had cost, and how long it had taken to put even half of that back. And then he stopped thinking about those things because they were not the point. The envelope was visible through the gap in the zipper, just the corner of it, cream-coloured, thick. He did not reach in. He zipped the purse closed. He held it on his lap with both hands and watched the street go by, and the street was the same wet grey it always was in February. And the bus smelled like wet coats and floor grime, and his stomach was running on the half a granola bar he'd eaten at 3 in the afternoon. He pulled the stop cord 2 blocks past his own stop so he could ride to the next one and get off near the precinct on the corner of Racine. He had not decided this consciously. His feet just took him there. He handed the purse to the desk officer at 7:48, unopened, and said he had found it on the 38. The officer looked at him the way people in those positions sometimes look at a 16-year-old boy on a winter evening. A look that was not exactly suspicion, but was not exactly its opposite. He logged it. He gave Marcus a slip of paper with a case number. Marcus was 19 minutes late to work. His manager docked him a half hour. He did not know when he handed that purse across the desk that its owner had been sitting in the passenger seat of her assistant's car for 40 minutes, calling her cell phone number over and over, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. He did not know her name, or that the $8,000 in that envelope was the operating float she had withdrawn in cash that morning for a vendor payment her new accountant had told her was due by end of business. He didn't know that she had already spent the bus ride calculating what she would tell her board if the money was gone, how she would cover the vendor, whether this was the thing that finally broke what she had spent 31 years building. He just went back to work. He made sandwiches. He took the 38 home at midnight and didn't mention it to his mother because he didn't want her to worry about things she couldn't control, and he figured it was over. It wasn't over. Renee Curtis had raised Marcus mostly alone since he was 4 when his father left for Cincinnati and called less and less until the calls stopped. She had raised him in the way that people who have very little raise children they love very much, which is to say with an almost fierce emphasis on what cannot be taken. She told him the money would come and go and be earned and lost and earned again. She told him his name meant something. She told him that the person you were when no one was looking was the only person that mattered. She was a home health aide during the day and a cashier at a grocery on the near South Side 2 evenings a week, and she came home tired in a way that lived in her shoulders, but she always asked about his day, always ate dinner with him when she was home for it, and she had never, not once in his life, let him see her stop trying. Marcus had absorbed this the way children absorb what their parents actually do, rather than what they say. He didn't think of himself as a particularly good person. He thought of himself as someone who was mostly too tired to be complicated. The truth was that returning the purse had not felt like a decision to him. It had felt like the only natural thing to do with someone else's property. The $12 in his account had nothing to do with it. The negative lunch balance had nothing to do with it. Some people would say that made it something worth noting to give back $8,000 from a position of need. Marcus would have said he just didn't know how to keep something that wasn't his, and left it there. His manager at the sub shop was named Phil. Phil was not a bad man, but he was a man who had stopped believing in much, and he had long ago concluded that teenagers were to be supervised rather than respected, and that Marcus in particular, who was quiet in a way Phil read as sullen, needed watching. When Marcus came in 8 minutes late on the Thursday after the purse, Phil said, loud enough for the two other employees to hear, that punctuality was not optional and that if Marcus couldn't manage a basic professional expectation, he should consider whether this job was right for him. Marcus said, "Yes, sir." He went to the prep station and started cutting tomatoes. The other two employees were a girl named Deja, who was also 16 and was saving for a laptop, and who had the particular quality of being able to hold a full conversation with a customer while loading a sandwich with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 30 years, and a man named Curtis, who was 38 and worked the closing shift because it fit around a day job at a warehouse on Kedzie. Curtis had 3 kids. He talked about them constantly and without any apparent awareness that not everyone found the detailed schedule of a second grader's soccer practices as compelling as he did. Marcus found that he did not mind hearing about them. There was something in the way Curtis talked about his children, the plain, uncomplicated fact of his pride in them, that he found easier to be around than almost anything else at the end of a school day. He had been at the sub shop for 11 months. He earned $9.40 an hour and worked between 15 and 20 hours a week, depending on what Phil could schedule around school. He had started the job because his mother's car had needed a timing belt in March, and the repair had taken everything in the emergency fund, and he had wanted her to start rebuilding it without him adding to the drain. He had never told her that was why he got the job. He just told her he wanted spending money. There are things a 16-year-old boy does quietly for his mother that the world will never log, that no one will ever name. This was one of them. He brought home his check every 2 weeks, left $40 on the kitchen counter with a note that said it was for groceries, and kept the rest in the account in case something else broke. He was not waiting for anything to come of this. On a Monday in late March, 6 weeks after the bus and the precinct and the purse, Marcus was helping his mother carry her work bag to the car when a black town car pulled slowly up to the curb in front of their building. He didn't pay it much attention. The window came down on the passenger side and a woman leaned out. She was maybe 60, black, wearing a dark coat, her hair natural and silver at the temples, and she had the kind of stillness that comes from having made a great many decisions and survived their consequences. "Excuse me," she said. "Is one of you Marcus Curtis?" His mother tightened her grip on her bag. Marcus said, "That's me." The woman looked at him for a moment in a way that was hard to read. Not suspicious, something more like the look a person gets when they have been thinking about something for a long time and have finally arrived at the place where it is real. "My name is Diane Okafor," she said. "I believe you found something of mine." Diane Okafor had built Okafor Staffing Solutions over 31 years, starting with a folding table, a fax machine, and a list of 47 businesses on the south side of Chicago that she had visited in person. In a suit she'd paid $62 for at a resale shop on Cottage Grove. She had placed her first worker in February of the year she started, a woman named Iris who was coming off a layoff from a packaging plant and needed benefits, and needed them soon. Iris had 3 children and a commute that ran an hour each way on 2 buses, and she had been turned down by 6 placement agencies before she walked into Diane's office, which at that point was the back room of a nail salon whose owner was a cousin, and Diane had spent 3 hours on the phone that afternoon until she found her a position at a distribution centre on the southeast side that offered health insurance and would work around her bus schedule. By the end of that first year, she had placed 93 workers. By the end of the first decade, the number was several thousand. By the time her name appeared in a Chicago Tribune profile of mid-size minority-owned businesses in the city, she had placed over 60,000 workers across 16 years, and the company had 34 full-time employees and offices in 3 cities. She had built it on a principle she stated plainly in that Tribune profile, that the people who had the hardest time getting jobs were almost always people who would do them better than anyone, if someone would simply open the door. The morning Marcus had found her purse on the 38, she had been coming from a meeting with a commercial real estate broker about a 4th office location. She had withdrawn the $8,000 in cash because the vendor she used for her office network installations was an older man named Clarence, who had been in business since 1987 and still conducted significant transactions in cash because he said it kept his books clean and he didn't like middlemen. She had been on the phone with her assistant about the meeting while she transferred from one bus to the other, and the purse had slipped from her lap without her noticing until she was halfway home in the car. What happened after Marcus turned it in was this. The precinct called the number on the ID in the purse, and Diane's assistant picked up and the purse was retrieved by noon. Everything was intact. The $8,000 was intact. Even a small laminated photograph Diane kept in the card slot, a picture of her own mother taken in 1979 in a garden in Lagos, was intact. Diane had asked the desk officer if there was anything on the case log about who had brought it in. The officer checked and told her it was a minor, so the name was held. She thanked him. She drove home. She thought about it for 6 weeks. She thought about it the way she thought about things that did not resolve cleanly, which was persistently and underneath everything else. She thought about it at her desk and in the car, and during a board meeting in the third week of March when a member was presenting a Q1 summary, and she found herself doing the math on what it would have meant to lose $8,000 in February specifically, given the vendor payment and the office expansion, and the fact that her line of credit was sitting thinner than she liked. She thought about it because it wasn't really about the money, and she had known that from the moment her assistant brought the purse to the car and she opened it and found the envelope still sealed. $8,000 in cash, returned without a single bill missing by someone who hadn't even left their name. She thought about who did that. She had been in the business of placing workers for 31 years, and she had interviewed thousands of people, and she had a particular instinct, developed through that many hours of sitting across a table from human beings and trying to read what they would do under pressure, and that instinct told her that the person who found a sealed envelope of cash and carried it to a police precinct without opening it first was not a person you simply wrote a thank you note to and moved on. She found Marcus through channels that a woman with 31 years of professional networks and the patience of someone who had built something from nearly nothing could navigate without much difficulty. She found his name on the case log through a city councilman she knew, and she matched it to a school enrollment record, and she matched that to an address, and she sat with that address on a notepad on her kitchen table for 4 more days before she decided what she wanted to do. She had considered writing a letter. She had considered sending a check. She had decided against both because neither of them was the right instrument for what she was actually trying to say, and she had spent 31 years learning that the wrong instrument, however well-intentioned, sent the wrong message. She arrived on a Monday morning and waited in the car until she saw a boy come out of the building with a woman who was probably his mother, and she knew from the way he walked, steady and a little tired and unassuming, that she had the right person. She did not tell him any of this on the sidewalk. She asked if he had a few minutes. Renee, who had been watching the whole thing with the particular careful attention of a mother whose child is being approached by a stranger from a town car, said she would wait. Diane got out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk with him and told him what had been in the purse and what it would have meant to lose it, not in dollar terms, but in the way it had sat in her chest for 40 minutes in the car, the feeling of something she had built starting to crack. Marcus listened. Then Diane said, "I want to do something to thank you. I want to do something real. I've been turning it over for 6 weeks trying to figure out what that looks like." Marcus said, "You don't have to do anything." Diane looked at him. "I know I don't have to." She asked him what he was planning to do after high school. He said he didn't know yet. He was thinking about community college, maybe business. He had been working to help with the house and hadn't had as much time to think about it as he probably should have. He said it without complaint. It was just the situation. Diane nodded slowly. She asked if he would be willing to come to her offices sometime just to see what the company did. He said he would. He went home and told his mother. Renee sat at the kitchen table for a long moment. "She's not going to ask you for something," she said. "She didn't seem like that kind of person," Marcus said. "People don't always seem like what they are," Renee said. "I know," Marcus said. "I'll be careful." He was not careless. He was 17 when he first walked into the offices of Okafor Staffing on the 17th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, in his best pair of slacks and the collared shirt his mother had pressed that morning. He stood in the lobby and looked out at the lake and felt something he couldn't name precisely, though it was close to the feeling that things could be other than what they were. The lobby had plants, tall ones in concrete pots, and the floor was a pale stone that was nothing like the linoleum at the sub-shop or the worn tile of his school's hallway. People moved through it with the particular unhurriedness of people who had somewhere to be and were not afraid of where it was. A receptionist asked for his name and called someone, and he stood by the window with his hands at his sides and tried to look like he came to places like this regularly. Diane came out herself to get him. She was wearing a grey blazer and her reading glasses were pushed up on her head, and she shook his hand and said, "I'm glad you came," and meant it. He could tell when people meant it. He had not, if we are being precise, expected much. He had expected to spend an hour being shown around and thanked again, and perhaps given a cheque with some zeros on it, which he would have been grateful for and which would have been the end of it. What happened instead was that Diane introduced him to her operations director, a compact man named James who moved through the office like someone who had work to do and was genuinely curious about other people's. And James asked Marcus 3 questions about logistics in the first 8 minutes that Marcus answered without thinking about, and then immediately wondered why James was writing down what he said. James showed him the intake floor, the rows of workstations where coordinators matched candidates to open positions, the whiteboard with the week's placement numbers written in marker. He showed him the filing system, which was partly paper and partly digital, and which had a conversion step in the middle that required someone to manually key information that already existed in a form on the other side of the desk. Marcus asked why they did it that way. James said they'd always done it that way. Marcus nodded and didn't say anything else. He shadowed the company for 2 Saturdays in a row. Then Diane offered him a paid summer internship. He worked it. He came in every day in June and July and half of August, and he was not there to be watched over or indulged. He learned the names of the coordinators on the intake floor. He learned that the woman in the second row from the window, whose name was Cora, had been with the company for 14 years and kept a laminated list of every candidate she had ever placed, updated by hand in a small notebook she carried in her apron pocket, and that this notebook was, in practice, a more accurate record of outcomes than any database the company had built. He sat with Cora on his lunch breaks and asked her questions, and she told him things about the work that you could only learn by doing it for 14 years. He asked questions, and he noticed things, and he stayed late without being asked. He noticed that the intake process for new job candidates was losing time in a particular step where the paper forms had to be re-entered into a digital system, and he built a spreadsheet template that eliminated the double entry. And he showed it to James without making a thing of it, just left it on his desk with a note explaining the time saving per candidate. James showed it to Diane. Diane used it by the following week. She called him into her office in the second week of August. He sat across from her at the long table she used for meetings, his hands on his knees, waiting. "You know what this company does," she said. It wasn't a question. "Opens the door," he said. Something moved behind her eyes. She told him she had been thinking, since the day she met him on the sidewalk, about what it meant that a boy with $12 in his account had returned $8,000 without a second thought. She told him she had stopped trying to explain it in terms of character, because character was too small a word for what it pointed at. She told him that she had spent 31 years trying to find people who had that quality, the quality of the person who does the right thing when nobody is watching and expects nothing for it, and that those people were rare in the world in general and genuinely precious in a business, and that she had never once in her career been uncertain about what to do when she found one. She slid a folder across the table. He opened it. There were a lot of pages. He is not a lawyer, and he will tell you now, years later, that he understood maybe a third of what he was reading in real time. What he understood was the number at the top of the cover sheet, which was a percentage, 15%, and the word beneath it, which was equity. "I want you to come work for me properly," Diane said, "after you finish school. I want to set aside 15% of this company in your name, vested over 5 years, starting when you join full-time. I want to pay for your education, whatever that looks like, and I want you to eventually run this place, not because you found a purse, because of who you were when you found it." Marcus sat with the folder in his hands and didn't say anything for a moment. He thought about his mother. He thought about the timing belt and the $40 on the kitchen counter and the midnight bus. He thought about Phil telling him that punctuality was not optional, loud enough for the room to hear. He thought about the 11 minutes the bus had been late and the feeling of something under his hand that didn't belong there and the decision that hadn't really felt like a decision at all. "Can I bring my mother?" he said finally. "I was going to ask the same thing," Diane said. Renee Curtis came to that office on a Saturday morning in her good coat. She sat across the table from Diane and read every page of the folder with the reading glasses she had bought for $12 at the pharmacy on 63rd, and she asked 12 questions, each of them precise, each of them the question of a woman who had been paying close attention to the world for a long time and was not about to stop now. Diane answered all 12 without deflecting a single one. At the end, Renee looked at her daughter and then looked at Diane and said, "I believe you mean what you're saying." "I do," Diane said. "Then we'll talk to a lawyer," Renee said. "And if it reads the way you're describing it, we'll say yes." It read the way Diane described it. Marcus finished his senior year at his high school on the west side. He graduated in June in the 4th row from the front, and his mother sat in the bleachers with his aunt and his 2 cousins and a woman named Iris, who had been the very first person Diane ever placed in a job, 31 years prior, and who had become, over those years, something close to a member of the family. He walked across the stage and shook the principal's hand and found his mother's face in the bleachers, and she was not trying to hold anything back. He enrolled in a business program at a state school in the fall. Diane covered tuition and housing. He drove home once a month. He called his mother 3 times a week. He did not stop working because he didn't know how not to. If you are wondering whether the work of the next 4 years was easy or obvious, the answer is that it was not. College was difficult in the ways it is difficult for a first-generation student who has been working since he was 15 and who has to learn, in his sophomore year, how to ask for help without feeling like he is admitting a deficiency. He was one of very few black students in his business program. He sat in classes where other students had parents who had walked them through spreadsheets since middle school, who talked about internships the way Marcus talked about shifts, as things you fit around the rest of your life rather than things you had to reach for. He was not behind. He was not ahead. He was present in a way that was costing him something real, and he paid it. He interned at Okafor in his sophomore and junior summers. Each time, James gave him a slightly harder problem. His sophomore summer, it was analysing the average time to placement across the 4 coordinators with the highest closure rates and writing a summary of what they were doing differently. His junior summer, it was rebuilding the onboarding checklist for new corporate clients from scratch, using interviews with 6 existing clients whose engagement had lapsed, finding the pattern in when and why they had stopped calling. Marcus found the pattern. He wrote it up in 8 pages. James read it twice. He sent it to Diane with a note that said, "This one is real." There were weeks in his junior year where the coursework was dense and the internship hours at Okafor were long, and he sat at his kitchen table at midnight and thought about the path from the sub shop on North Clark to a lease on a studio apartment near campus, and it felt both enormous and provisional, as though it could be taken back. He called his mother on those nights. She always picked up. She told him on those calls some version of what she had always told him. Being tired was not the same as being beaten, and the difference between the two was the next morning. She told him to eat something real and go to sleep. She asked what he had for dinner. He said he was fine. She said he had not answered her question. He told her he'd had a sandwich from the gas station at 10, and she made a sound that conveyed her exact feelings on this without her having to say anything else. He laughed. She said she was serious. He said he knew. He said good night and meant it. He came back to Okafor full-time 2 weeks after graduation at 23 as a junior operations manager. James, who was now the VP of operations and had quietly been his mentor for 3 years without either of them ever giving it that name, put him in charge of the candidate intake system, which was still running on the spreadsheet Marcus had built as a 17-year-old intern, now integrated into the main database, but still traceable back to that original note on James's desk. The 5 years of vesting passed in the way that 5 years pass when you're working hard, which is quickly and not at all. He became a manager of operations. He became a director. He sat in on board meetings, first as the note-taker, and then as the person James deferred to when the question was about systems and workflow, and then, in his 4th year, as the person Diane deferred to when the question was about what the company should become. He learned that Diane was not a simple person. She was demanding in ways that had taken him time to understand as a form of respect, and which he had initially read in his first months back full-time as skepticism. She pushed on his reasoning when she thought it was soft. She sent documents back with questions in the margins rather than corrections, which meant you had to find the error yourself, which he eventually understood was the point. She held him to the same standard she held everyone she believed in, which was a high one, and she never reduced it because of where he had started or because of any story she told herself about where he had come from. That was the thing that mattered most. She did not pity him. She expected him. There was a meeting in his third year, a quarterly review with the board, where a board member named Fletcher, who was older and wore his skepticism openly, asked Marcus a pointed question about the overhead structure of the Chicago office in a tone that was meant to suggest the question was too complex for him. Marcus answered it in 3 sentences. Fletcher wrote something down. Diane did not say anything, did not catch Marcus's eye, did not do anything at all. She did not need to. He was not being tested for her benefit. On the morning the equity stake fully vested, Diane came to his office, which was small and looked out on an alley rather than the lake. She knocked on the open door. 5 years, she said. 5 years, he said. She set a small framed copy of the original cover sheet on his desk, the one with 15% on it. He looked at it for a moment, then he picked it up and looked at the back, and she had written something on the back in her handwriting, which was fine and careful. You did the right thing when no one was looking. The rest is the consequence. He put it on the wall above his desk, where it still is. Renee had retired from the home health aide job by then. Her shoulder had been bad for 2 years, and her doctor had been telling her since the previous summer that she needed to stop. She fought it the way she fought everything she didn't want to be true, quietly and for too long. The last client she had, a woman in her 70s named Mrs. Parrish, who lived alone in a first-floor apartment on the near south side and who needed help with her morning routine and her medications, asked Renee on her last day if she was sure she had to go. Renee said her shoulder had made the decision for her. Mrs. Parrish held her hand for a moment. Neither of them said anything else. Marcus had bought out the lease on a first-floor apartment for his mother, 3 rooms and a garden patch in the back where she grew tomatoes in containers every summer, and he paid the bills on it, and she accepted this without much ceremony, the way people accept things from their children when the children have grown into someone they recognize, someone they were part of making. She filled the days. She cooked, which she had not had time for properly in 15 years. She read, which she had not had time for at all. She became, slowly, the kind of person who had opinions about what time of day you should water tomatoes and whether the particular variety she'd planted that year was worth the trouble, and she communicated these opinions to Marcus by text with a confidence that made him smile. He came home for dinner on the second Sunday of every month, and she made the food he had grown up eating, and they sat at the table in the kitchen where the window looked out at the garden and talked about nothing in particular for a long time. She was proud of him. She told him, on a Sunday at dinner, the particular way she said it, without build-up or preamble, just as a statement of fact. The way she told him things that she believed were simply true. She said she was proud of him, not because of the company, not because of the 15%, not because of any of the things that had a number attached. She said she was proud of him because he was still the person who hadn't opened the purse. He laughed. She did too. It was a warm night in June, and the kitchen window was open, and the tomatoes in the garden behind the building were coming up. There are moments in a life that you do not recognize as the hinge they are until you are standing far enough away from them. Marcus had found the purse on a Tuesday in February, cold enough that the windows of the 38 were fogged, and he had been tired, and he had been late, and the $12 in his account had felt that night like a joke that had gone on too long. He had held the purse on his lap for 7 blocks, feeling its weight, and he had not once considered keeping it, not because he was trying to be a good person, but because the idea of keeping it had not quite assembled itself into a real option in his mind. The $8,000 had belonged to someone else. That was simply what was true. He had not known it would take him anywhere. He had not known it would take him to a sidewalk conversation with a woman who had spent 31 years opening doors, or to a long table and a folder with 15% on the cover sheet, or to 5 years of hard incremental work that felt nothing like a reward, and everything like being trusted with something that demanded he be equal to it. He had not known any of that. He had just gotten off at the next stop and handed the purse across the desk and gone to work. Diane will tell you, if you ask her, that the moment she found Marcus on that sidewalk was the moment she understood something she had believed in principle, but not in fact. She will tell you that she had built a company on the idea that the people who had the hardest time getting jobs were the people most worth having, and that on a Monday morning in March she had finally met the proof of it in a 16-year-old boy in a school backpack who said he didn't need a thank you and meant it. What she offered him was the company. What she was actually doing, she will say, was recognizing what was already there. Marcus is 31 now. He is a partner and the chief operating officer of Okafor Staffing Solutions. The company places workers in 4 cities. The candidate intake system that runs on his original design has processed over 40,000 applicants. He has a small team under him, 7 people, each of whom he interviewed himself, and the first question he always asks is not about experience. It is about a specific moment when they had a choice and nobody was watching. His mother's tomatoes come in every August. He goes home for 2 weeks in the summer and eats them sliced on the porch with salt, which is how she has always made them. And they sit there in the evening, and the city does its city things around them, and neither of them feels the need to say much. He still takes the bus when it makes sense. He probably always will. What would you do if you found $8,000 in a bag on a seat beside you, with no one watching, no way to be caught, no way to be known? Think about it for a moment. Let the question sit. Then come back and tell us in the comments, because the answer is the kind of thing that says something true about a person. If this story moved you, there is another one waiting for you right after this, about a woman who kept a promise for 17 years that no one knew she had made. Stay with us. These are stories worth finishing. Diane retired from the executive chair the following spring. She is on the board. She comes in on Wednesdays and sometimes Thursdays, and she walks the floors and asks people how it is going, and they tell her, and she listens in the way that people who built something from 47 visits and a $62 suit know how to listen. On the day Marcus moved into the executive office, the one that looks out at the lake rather than the alley, he hung the framed cover sheet on the wall across from the window where the light hits it in the afternoon. Diane's handwriting in the low right corner, 15% across the top. He had not opened the purse. That is all it had been in the beginning. The smallest possible thing. He had not opened the purse, and he had gotten off at the next stop, and he had handed it across the desk, and then he had gone to work 19 minutes late on a night when his account held $12 and the heat in the building had been out for 3 days. The world keeps a ledger even when people do not. It had kept his.